Zenit is a football club based in St. Petersburg, Russia, a beautiful city of over 5 million people. St. Petersburg is famous for her palaces and canals and rivers. She is famous for her culture and is often called the Venice of the North. Now, Zenit St. Petersburg today play in the 68,000 capacity Gazprom Arena, which is a beautiful new stadium. They are supported by President Vladimir Putin and they're owned by the enormous Gazprom oil and gas company. Every year they seem to win the Russian league and every year they are in European competition. So this is a rich and successful club, but it's not always been this way. The origins of Zenit St. Petersburg are much more humble, and I'm going to tell you more about that and about why I support the club. Now, Zenit was formed during a very dark period in Russia's history. From 1914 to 1918, there was the First World War, during which over 2 million Russians tragically perished. Then in 1917, there was the Bolshevik Revolution, which created the Soviet Union and condemned millions of people to a century of socialism and terror and poverty and misery. And then in 1918 until 1922, there was the Russian Civil War, which tore the country apart. The club was officially founded in 1925 by the merger of several teams, and in 1936 the name Zenit was registered. Zenit translates as zenith, which means the time at which something is most powerful or successful. Ironically, Zenit Football Club wasn't very successful for the next 80 years. Now, Zenit St. Petersburg has always been adored in the city of St. Petersburg, but has never been a great success compared to the Moscow teams like Spartak, CSKA, Lokomotiv and Dynamo, or compared to teams like Dynamo Kiev in the Ukraine or Dynamo Tbilisi in Georgia. On a national level, Zenit has always been seen as the underdogs, and this is central to the ongoing ethos of the club. There's always been a sort of anti-establishment, anti-Moscow feeling to the club, a feeling that the politicians are in Moscow, the rules are made there, and that everyone is against us. In fact, the club's zenith prior to the takeover by Gazprom was in 1984, when little Zenit won the Soviet League title for the first and only time. In 1992, after the Soviet Union had collapsed, the Russian League was started, and Zenit were relegated straight away. Now, I went to live and work in Moscow in 1993, and while I was there, I went to see Spartak and Dynamo and some of the other clubs of Moscow, but I couldn't really bring myself to support a Moscow team. I mean, I'm a Bolton Wanderers fan. I support the underdog, and there's no way I was going to support a glory team. In 1996, I moved up to St. Petersburg to set up my cafe bar restaurant, the Cafe Idiot. And this is where I met a bunch of Zenit fans, including my good friend Alyosha. And over beers they said to me, "Tomorrow, Stephen, you're going to the Petrovsky Stadium. We're going to introduce you to Zenit St. Petersburg." Now, interestingly, 1996 was the year that Zenit were promoted back into the first tier of Russian football. And that year they finished 10th in the league. So this is a small to medium-sized club. Now, let me tell you about match day at Zenit St. Petersburg. We'd always meet up at the penalty bar, which can only be described as a dive bar near the ground. You walk down a few steps and suddenly the wall of noise would surround you, the chants, the singing. There'd be the smell of stale beer and there'd be hundreds of men crowded into this dive bar. You'd drink your Balticas and you'd be singing Sini, Billy, Galaboya and all the other chants. You'd have 4 or 5 pints, you'd hug your mates, and then you'd start walking over the bridge to the ground. On the way, you'd meet a few more of your mates, there'd be more hugs, someone would hand you a Baltica number 3, and you'd have another couple of beers while discussing the team formations. Then it was a matter of getting past the police into the ground, and there would be 3 security cordons, and before you went in, you'd be hiding bottles of vodka under your armpit, under your cap, down your pants. 5 minutes later, you'd get into the ground and everyone would be pulling out hip flasks and bottles of vodka and bottles of beer. You'd have 50 grams to celebrate getting into the ground. Now, the facilities in those days can only be described as basic. You could buy some Coke or some popcorn, but there was nothing like you'd find in today's modern football grounds. In the ground, there was a diverse group of fans, but that includes some absolutely passionate ultras. And when those guys heard me speak English, they'd rush over to me and they'd be asking me questions about life as an English football hooligan, which is ironic because I've never been a hooligan in my life, but they'd be peppering me with questions. What do the hooligans wear these days in England? Who are the best firms and other such trivia? And I'd have to tell them, sorry mate, I'm just a fan. Now we'd get into the ground and it would be passionate. People would be singing and chanting from start to finish. And every 5 minutes or so, they'd have a shot of vodka to keep them warm. Now in those days, there was frequently fighting. If we were playing a team like Spartak Moscow, they'd be pitched battles outside the ground. Spartak and Zenit absolutely hate each other. In fact, Spartak are known as miasa, which translates as meat, but better translates as scum. And they're also known as Moskovsky Shashlik, which means the Moscow kebab. If Zenit were playing a team like CSKA, then there'd be a fight with police. Because of the anti-establishment nature of the Zenit fans, they absolutely detested the police. And I can remember games when seats were ripped out and thrown at the police and onto the pitch. These were absolutely mad days. At half-time, you'd rush down the stairs to the toilets, which could only be described as basic. And I can remember one time there was such a crush that the police were holding everyone back from the toilets to prevent a crush as everyone went in. And someone came up behind me and pushed me so that I fell into a policeman. And what he did, he got out his baton and whacked me across the stomach. Now, I must have sworn in English because I can remember this copper with this look upon his face. Oh my God, I've just hit a foreigner. And then you'd go back into the ground and the singing would continue. And often in those games, this is 25 years ago, I'm sure I've watched games that were fixed when refereeing decisions were so terrible. Penalties to Spartak or 15 minutes of extra time until the right result happened. You knew full well that some of those games 25 years ago were fixed with bribes. But whatever happened, the Zenit fans didn't matter. They'd be singing Sini Billy Galaboya, hey, 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 which means white, light blue and blue. They'd be singing Slushi Leningrad, ja tibia spayus zadushevnoyu pesnyu svayu. They'd be singing songs about St. Petersburg and about Zenit from start to finish. Now, people often ask me, did you ever encounter racism at Zenit games? And the answer is yes, sadly I did. 25 years ago, I witnessed bananas being thrown onto the pitch. I heard racist chants, I heard monkey noises. It was horrible, but I must say, even then, it was a minority. It was nothing to do with the people that I was with. And over the years, things have got better. Hulk, the Zenit striker, is on record of saying that he was racially abused in almost every game he played, including once by a Russian referee. None of that can be condoned, and I hope the Russian authorities are doing all they can to stamp out racism from the game. Certainly at the 2018 World Cup, the international community came together and I didn't witness one act of racism. I can remember great players like Alexander Panov, the Kolpina Rocket, who was 5'5" but knew how to put the ball in the back of the net. And then there was Alexander Kurzhakov, who scored 233 goals in Russian football, which is a record for the Russian league. And then, of course, there was the wonderful local lad Andrei Arshavin, and I saw his debut back in the year 2000. In fact, I was so impressed by Kurzhakov and Arshavin that I actually wrote a note to Sam Allardyce, the manager of Bolton Wanderers, and I said, Sam, this is probably the weirdest note you're ever going to get, but I'm a Bolton fan living in St. Petersburg, and you have to watch these guys, Kurzhakov and Arshavin. You could probably buy them both for £3 million. I can remember Zenit getting into the Intertoto Cup back in the year 2000 and drawing Bradford, and we all jumped on a plane, and I can remember my mate Alyosha turning up in Manchester with a massive Russian flag and waving it wherever he went. And we went up to Bradford about 3 hours before the game, a bunch of Russians and me, and we're looking for pubs, and we're going down the street with our Russian flags and our Zenit flags. And I can remember a car slowing down, and the lad stuck his head out the window and he said, "All right, lads," he said, "have a great day, but afterwards don't be claiming political asylum," which was not politically correct, but very, very funny. And I can remember we found this random pub in Bradford, and we went in, we're having a few pints with the locals, and we're really friendly. And I'm chatting to this middle-aged bloke, short bloke with curly hair, and I'm like, "Are you a Bradford fan?" And he's like, yeah, I'm not just a Bradford fan, I'm the mascot of the club. And I'm thinking, oh yeah, this is a wind-up. And he's like, no, it's true. He said, "I'm the city gent." He said, "Before the game, you'll see me. I come on the pitch with me bowler hat, and I wear a suit, and I got me brolly, and I throw sweets to the kids." I'm thinking, oh, this is a wind-up. And then, of course, a couple of hours later, who walks out on the pitch but the city gent? Anyway, Zenit won 3-0 that night, and a lot of vodka was drunk. I can remember in November 2005, the weirdest thing happened. Zenit drew Bolton in the Europa League group stages at the Reebok, and it was an incredibly rainy night, and Alyosha flew over again from St. Petersburg. We did an interview for BBC Radio, then straight down the ground, and this was the first time in my life I've ever been in the away end at the Reebok. Of course, I'm supporting Bolton, but I wanted to be amongst my Russian mates. And that day, what I remember most, it poured down, and the pitch, that game should not have gone ahead because the pitch was absolutely waterlogged. And Kevin Nolan got a goal, but Zenit should have equalised late, and the Russian fans had a fantastic time. 3 years later, and Zenit unbelievably got into the UEFA Cup Final in 2008. And who did they draw? Glasgow Rangers in Manchester. So all my Russian mates came over, and I'm thinking, right, today I'm going to put my Zenit shirt on and go into Manchester. So we get on the bus, we go into Piccadilly Gardens, and suddenly I realise I'm an English guy in Manchester wearing a Russia shirt surrounded by tens of thousands of Scots. So I said to the Russians, I said, right, from now on, I can only speak Russian. So we went into loads of pubs, of course, and I was struck by the friendliness of all the Rangers fans. When they saw a bunch of Zenit St. Petersburg lads, they got the beers in. So we didn't have to pay for a drink all night, and I'm going around speaking Russian because I don't want the Scots to realise there's an English guy wearing a Zenit shirt. Anyway, we get to the ground, and of course I've got a ticket in the Zenit end, and there's this Scottish lad there, and he's really downhearted. I said, what's the matter, mate? And he said, "Oh, do you speak English?" I said, "Yeah, of course." He said, "Well, I can't get into the ground because, I've got a ticket in the Zenit end." So I put my arm around him, and I said, "Right, from now on, your name's Sergey. I'm going to speak to you in Russian. And as we walk to the ground, all you've got to do is nod and say da, da, da. Say yes, yes, yes." So anyway, we get up to the stewards, and the stewards are like, "Are you Russians?" And we're like, "Konyeshna, da, 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 da." And Sergey's like, "Da, da, da, da." And we sneak in this Scottish lad, and he spends the whole time with the Zenit fans. And what a final that was. Zenit won 2-0. Heartbreak for Glasgow Rangers, but what an incredible night for Alyosha and the Zenit boys. So I lived in St. Petersburg from 1996 to 2002, and I had the time of my life. And every year I had a season ticket for Zenit. I made some great friends there, and we had some great memories. Now, Zenit weren't that brilliant during that time. They won the Russian Cup in 1999, and they slowly got better. But it wasn't until 2005 that Gazprom, the huge oil and gas company, came along and bought a majority stake in the club. And from that moment on, things got better. And 2 years later, Zenit won the Russian League. In fact, Zenit have now won the Russian League 7 times. The last time was yesterday, Zenit champion. And during that time, the managers of Zenit have included Dick Advocat, Andrei Villas-Boas and Roberto Mancini. And the current squad includes Branislav Ivanovic, Malcolm and Artyom Dzyuba. Supporting Zenit is about loving the club Zenit St. Petersburg and about loving the city of St. Petersburg. Your heart beats faster when you think about the White Knights, performances at the Mariinsky Theatre, the Baroque Winter Palace, Bochkarov Beer, Tchaikovsky, Sergei Shnurov, Dostoevsky and Anna Akhmatova. The vast majority of Zenit fans are passionate, cultured, friendly people who love their city and love their club. Supporting Zenit also implies that you're maybe a bit of a rebel at heart. Zenit fans happen to support a rich club these days, but the anti-establishment nature of the club somehow survives. I'm proud to be a Zenit supporter and I'm proud to wear the shirt. Zenit Champion.